They believed their experience made them safe, that knowledge and preparation were enough to keep the danger at bay. But nature doesn't follow human rules. It watches, it waits, and when the moment is right, it strikes without mercy. Like a twig snapping underfoot in the silence of the wild, one mistake was all it took. Instantly, their confidence crumbled, and they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. Join us as we delve into 6 gripping stories of bear attacks, where survival hangs by a thread, and the wilderness shows no mercy. The small, snow-covered town of Koryak lay under a thick blanket of clouds, the early morning sun doing little to warm the frozen air. It was February 10th, 2025, the kind of day where people moved quickly between buildings, eager to escape the cold. Most of the town's residents lived quiet lives, their routines shaped by the relentless winters and the isolation of their remote homes. They were used to the harsh conditions and the ever-present reality of nature creeping at the edges of their lives. But today, the balance between humans and the wild would tip into something unthinkable. Tatiana Orlov, a schoolteacher in her mid-40s, had stopped by the local grocery store to pick up bread and tea before heading home. She had lived in Koryak all her life, raising her 2 teenage sons alone after her husband died in a fishing accident. She had seen bears before. Everyone had, but they usually kept to the forests, driven away by noise and human presence. That morning, people had spoken about a Russian grizzly wandering too close to town, lingering near the outskirts, but no one had considered it an immediate threat. Winter was long, food was scarce, and hunger drove animals to strange places. Seeing desperate creatures lurking near the roads and searching for food was not unusual. It was something people acknowledged, but rarely feared. The store's owner, Alexei Petrov, had been stocking shelves when he first heard the disturbance. A strange, low, groaning noise carried through the cold air, followed by the rhythmic crunch of something heavy moving across the snow. He looked up just in time to see a massive shape barreling toward the glass doors. When Alexei saw the blur of matted brown fur and the monstrous bulk moving with unnatural speed, he knew what was happening. In seconds, the glass shattered inward, the brittle surface offering no resistance as the beast forced its way inside the grocery store. The few shoppers inside froze. For a moment, the only sound was the wind howling through the gaping entrance, accompanied by the crunch of broken glass beneath the bear's weight. But the stunned silence was soon shattered by a raw and jagged scream. The Russian grizzly, easily twice the size of a man, reared onto its hind legs, its massive head swinging from side to side at the sound. Its breath billowed in thick white clouds, nostrils flaring, eyes dark pits of hunger and rage. The scent of human bodies, food, and warmth must have driven it mad. It dropped onto all fours and charged. A man near the entrance didn't even have time to react before the bear was on him, a single swipe of its claws tearing through his chest and claiming his life with incredible ferocity. The man crumpled without a sound, blood spreading in thick pools around him. The sight sent the store into chaos. People ran in every direction, knocking over displays and shoving past one another in blind panic. Once neatly stocked with goods, the aisles became obstacles in a desperate race for survival. Those closest to the back tried to push through the storeroom doors, but in their frantic desperation, they clogged the exit, trapping themselves. Tatiana, the schoolteacher, turned and ran, her heart hammering, her breath coming in short gasps. She saw an elderly woman ahead of her trip, her cane skidding across the floor, her frail body collapsing onto the tiles. But before Tatiana could help the woman, the bear lunged. A sickening crunch echoed through the store as the beast's powerful jaws clamped down, lifting the woman like a rag doll. It shook its head once, twice, then tossed her aside, her broken body sliding limply across the floor. The bear roared, the sound rattling the air, a warning that sent fresh waves of panic through the trapped shoppers. The store's owner, Alexei, tried to reach the shotgun he kept behind the counter for situations like this, but the bear moved faster than human reflexes could allow. It crashed into the register, its weight knocking over shelves, sending cans and boxes cascading to the floor. Alexei barely had time to raise an arm before the creature was on him, its claws raking down his torso, splitting flesh, exposing bone. He screamed, the sound high and shrill until the bear crushed his throat with a single brutal bite. His body twitched once, then went still. Another woman tried to escape through the loading dock, but the heavy door jammed, ice locking it in place. She banged against it, fists bruising against the metal, sobs racking her body. The bear turned its head at the sound, its instincts locking onto her fear. The animal charged, slamming into her with cold efficacy. Her scream ended in a gurgle as it sank its teeth into her back, tearing chunks of her flesh. By now, the aisles were slick with blood, the air thick with the coppery scent of death. Those who had managed to avoid the bear cowered in whatever spaces they could find, beneath shelves, behind counters, curled into corners, hands pressed to their mouths to stifle their terrified sobs. A man hidden inside a refrigerator display gripped his arms to keep from shaking, sweat freezing against his skin. The bear, frenzied now, crushed displays beneath its bulk, sniffing, seeking, its hunger insatiable. Sirens wailed in the distance, but in a town as isolated as Koryak, help never came quickly enough. When the first shots rang out, the bear barely flinched, the bullets embedding into its thick hide but failing to stop it. It turned, eyes locking onto the approaching figures. Local authorities armed with rifles, their hands shaking despite their training. The bear lunged, covering the distance between them in seconds. One officer managed a clean shot, the bullet striking the beast just below the eye, but even wounded, it kept coming, swiping at anything in its path. Another shot rang out, then another. The bear staggered, its growl turning into a deep, rattling snarl. Blood poured from its wounds, its movements slowing. It swayed, nostrils flaring, steam rising from its body. Then, with one final, shuddering breath, it collapsed onto the blood-stained floor, its lifeless eyes still locked in a rage-filled glare. The store stood in ruins, littered with bodies, broken shelves, and shattered glass. The silence that followed was suffocating. 9 lives were lost that day, each one leaving an emptiness that would mark the town for generations to come. Families shattered, futures erased in minutes. The survivors would never forget the horror, the way death had come so suddenly, so violently. In the days that followed, the town would mourn and try to understand how such a thing had happened. People would speak of dramatic shifts in animal behavior, food shortages, and growing tension between man and the wild. But for those who had been there, who had heard the screams, seen the blood, felt the terror in their bones, there was only one certainty. The line between safety and savagery had never been thinner, and on that cold February morning, it had been obliterated. Kyle Davis had always thrived on adventure, building his successful YouTube channel around daring solo expeditions into the wild. His subscribers loved his mix of confidence, charisma, and ability to turn every trip into a gripping survival story. At 27, he had spent years honing his outdoor skills and entertaining his audience with almost unimaginable adventures, some more authentic than others. But on May 19, 2024, Kyle would experience his greatest challenge yet. That morning, Kyle had set out on a trail deep within the Smoky Mountains, eager to capture footage for his latest video. The forest was alive with birdsong, the dense canopy above filtering soft rays of sunlight onto the path. He moved carefully, his camera rolling, narrating each step with practiced ease. His audience loved his personality, the almost unfiltered stream of his thoughts, and he prided himself on delivering just that. He had packed light, only essentials. His bear spray hung from his belt, a tool he had never needed. He trekked through the wilderness for hours, pausing now and then to explain foraging techniques, demonstrate water purification, and discuss navigation skills. As the afternoon wore on, he noticed fresh claw marks on a nearby tree, deep grooves cutting through the bark, a sign of a black bear. He knew the creatures roamed these mountains but had never encountered one up close. His pulse quickened, excitement flickering in his chest. This was exactly the kind of footage his viewers would love. Kyle adjusted his camera, moving cautiously toward the marks and scanning the surroundings. Soon after, he saw the animal, a black bear, roughly 100 feet ahead, sniffing the air, its powerful body shifting with each slow step. He had seen bears before, but always at a distance and with a clear escape route. Now, standing in the undergrowth, he had a decision to make. His instincts told him to back away, but his content-driven mind urged him forward. Carefully, he adjusted his zoom, steadying his hands as he focused on the bear. It hadn't noticed him yet, its attention fixed on something in the distance. He crept forward, hoping for a closer shot. The wind shifted. The bear lifted its head. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. If anything, the bear seemed curious. Kyle dared to take a step forward, and with that small step, the bear's curiosity turned into something far more dangerous. The animal huffed, nostrils flaring, its muscles tensed. Kyle had seen enough documentaries to recognize the warning. He knew better than to run. Instead, he slowly stepped back, trying to create distance. But the bear wasn't retreating. It advanced, ears flattened, eyes locked onto him with an intensity that sent a spike of fear through his gut. He reached for his bear spray, his fingers fumbling with the latch. Too slow. Before he knew it, the bear charged. The impact sent Kyle sprawling backward. His camera tumbled from his hands, landing in the dirt, still recording. The bear's claws raked across his chest, slicing deep into his skin. Kyle's breath was knocked from his lungs, which hurt almost as badly as the fresh wounds on his chest. The bear's weight pressed down on him, its growl vibrating through his bones. He raised an arm to shield his face, but the bear's teeth sank into his forearm, crushing muscle and tendon with terrifying force. Adrenaline surged through Kyle, taking over his body. He twisted, struggling to break free. He could hear his ragged gasps, the frantic pounding of his heart, and the sound of the forest closing around him. Every survival instinct screamed at him to fight, but the sheer strength of the animal was overwhelming. His vision blurred, pain swallowing every rational thought. That's when he heard the voices calling out somewhere in the distance. Footsteps crashed through the underbrush. The bear hesitated, its ears flicking toward the approaching sounds. Kyle seized the moment. With his uninjured arm, he reached for the bear spray, his fingers finally closing around the canister. He aimed mindlessly, pressing down on the nozzle. A sharp burst of aerosol erupted, filling the air between them. The bear recoiled. As suddenly as it had attacked, it turned and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Kyle lay still, chest heaving, his body screaming in pain. Blood seeped from deep gashes, soaking into the earth beneath him. The sound of approaching hikers grew louder, their voices filled with panic. He tried to move, but collapsed, the world tilting violently around him. By the time help reached him, he was barely conscious. Someone pressed a jacket against his wounds, and another hand gripped his shoulder, steadying him. His camera, still lying where it had fallen, had captured the entire attack. This footage would later send shockwaves through his audience, igniting debates across social media about the risks of filming wildlife without proper precautions. A helicopter arrived within the hour, its blades slicing through the sky as Kyle was carefully lifted into the rescue basket. The pain was unbearable, radiating through every fiber of his body, but he was alive. As the ground fell away beneath him, the forest stretching endlessly below, he closed his eyes, his mind spinning with the weight of what had just happened. The recovery was slow and agonizing. Multiple surgeries, weeks of physical therapy, and months of psychological scars that ran deeper than the wounds on his body. His family, his mother and younger sister, had rushed to his side, their relief mixed with anger at the recklessness that had nearly cost him everything. They had always supported his passion, but had never imagined it would come this close to tragedy. When he finally returned to his channel, he didn't do so with his usual bravado or dramatic storytelling. He uploaded the unedited raw footage, allowing his viewers to witness the reality of what had happened. There are no cinematic effects, no polished narration, just the brutal, terrifying truth. The response was immediate. Some blamed him for being irresponsible and for prioritizing content over safety. Others expressed their horror and newfound respect for nature's unpredictable power. Kyle chimed in, urging people to learn from his mistake and understand the fine line between admiration and recklessness. Kyle had always believed in the importance of experiencing nature firsthand, of sharing the beauty of the wilderness with the world, but he had learned, in the most violent way possible, that some lines should never be crossed. Night after night, as he stared at the scars on his body, reminders of the day he had come face to face with raw survival, he knew one thing for certain: he would never see the wild the same way again. At 44, Thomas Graham was an experienced camper accustomed to nature's unpredictability. He enjoyed exploring Alaska's untamed wilderness. His dog, Buddy, a loyal golden retriever, had been his constant companion for years, joining him on countless expeditions into the wild. They shared an unbreakable bond, one built on trust and companionship. On June 6, 2023, that bond would be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The air was crisp that late afternoon. The towering trees swayed gently in the wind, and the fading light cast long shadows across the campsite. Graham had set up camp near a secluded river where he felt most at home. As the fire crackled, He leaned back in his chair, watching Buddy sniff around the perimeter, his tail wagging lazily. The stillness of the evening was deceptive, masking the lurking danger that was about to turn their trip into a nightmare. Without warning, a massive Kodiak bear emerged from the tree line, its hulking form moving with unsettling grace. Graham's heart pounded as he took in the beast's sheer size. Buddy's demeanor changed instantly. The retriever stiffened, his fur bristling, and a deep, warning growl rumbled from his throat. The bear hesitated momentarily before approaching, deciding the dog wasn't an impressive opponent. But Buddy kept barking, a sharp, desperate sound that shattered the quiet night. The sound angered the bear. Buddy leapt forward, his instinct driving him to protect his owner. The bear swiped a massive paw, sending the dog to the ground with a whimper. Graham shouted, rushing toward his injured companion, but the bear had already turned its attention toward him. The force of the animal's charge sent him tumbling backward, his body colliding with the hard earth. Before he could scramble away, the bear was on him. Graham had never felt pain like this before. The animal's weight was crushing. The man could almost feel his bones giving in under the pressure. Panic surged through him as he struggled against the predator's sheer power. He lashed out, fists pounding against thick fur, but the blows were pointless. The bear's claws raked across his shoulder. The pain was sharp. Breathing was becoming more and more difficult. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the dirt. He gasped for breath, his mind racing, searching for any possible escape. Before he could come up with anything, the bear bit down on his arm. The immense pressure caused the bones to crack beneath the bear's jaws this time. Graham screamed, the sound raw and filled with agony. He kicked, desperate to break free. Darkness threatened to consume him, his vision swimming to the edges of unconsciousness. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the bear lifted its head. Something had caught its attention. The sudden arrival of other campers had startled it. It released Graham and disappeared into the trees. Graham lay motionless, his body shattered, his breath ragged and uneven. Pain coursed through every nerve, but he was alive. Voices grew closer, urgent and panicked. Hands pressed against his wounds, trying to slow the bleeding. He could barely register the words around him, his consciousness slipping away. Emergency responders arrived swiftly, their helicopters slicing through the night sky. Graham was carefully lifted into the aircraft, his body barely clinging to life. The last thing he saw before everything faded was Buddy, injured but alive, his eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. The road to recovery was long and arduous. Multiple surgeries, endless hours of rehabilitation, and the lingering trauma of the attack haunted him. Buddy never left his side despite his injuries, a constant reminder of the fight they had survived together. The attack sent ripples through the community, reigniting conversations about the fragile balance between humans and wildlife. Some called for stricter regulations on camping in bear country, while others insisted that such encounters were simply a risk of venturing into the wild. For Graham, the debate was irrelevant. He had faced death and survived, but he had also learned a brutal truth. Nature was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. And out there, nothing could guarantee your survival. His scars would never fade, and neither would the memories. But as he looked at Buddy resting beside him, he knew one thing for certain. They had fought and survived, and that bond could never be broken. David, Emily, and Mark were three lifelong friends who had always embraced the wilderness, and their passion for hiking took them to some of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. They had met in an outdoor survival camp when they were kids and had since built a friendship forged through shared adventure and trust. Each had their strengths. 35-year-old David was a former park ranger with extensive knowledge of animal behavior. Emily, 33, had a background in environmental science, and her love for the wild was deeply rooted in a respect for nature's delicate balance. At 34, Mark had served in search and rescue, and his experience gave him a calm, strategic mind in high-pressure situations. They were not reckless amateurs, but seasoned hikers who understood the risks of venturing into the wild. On January 14, 2025, they embarked on a winter trek through a national park in the northwest corner of Wyoming, a journey planned for months. The snow-covered expanse stretched endlessly before them, a breathtaking yet formidable landscape. They were well-equipped with thermal gear, satellite communication devices, and bear spray, a necessity even in winter when most bears should have been hibernating. They had studied the area's recent wildlife activity and saw no indication of immediate danger. But nature is unpredictable. and each trek has its risks. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the three followed the frozen riverbank, their boots crunching through the ice-crusted snow, the only noise in the silence. It was a peaceful but deceptive stillness. Unbeknownst to them, they had entered the territory of a grizzly, one that had not fully succumbed to hibernation due to food scarcity. A towering beast, underfed and desperate, had been tracking them for miles, its primal instincts driving it toward an opportunity for survival. After a few hours, they heard something. David was the first to stop, his body rigid as he turned his head toward the sound. Emily and Mark followed his gaze. At first, there was nothing but the towering pines, their branches heavy with snow. Then, a massive and purposeful blur of brown moved between the trees. The bear emerged, its eyes sunken with hunger, its breath curling into the cold air like smoke from a fire. David knew the protocol. The bear was a grizzly, one of the fiercest predators out there. Fighting it was the last thing they wanted. No, they had to make a quick but safe escape. Slowly they backed away, hands hovering near their bear spray. However, this wasn't an accidental encounter. The bear had been following them for hours, hunger gnawing at its insides. It wanted to feed. With terrifying speed, it charged, closing the distance in seconds. Emily reacted first, unclipping her canister and unleashing a powerful spray aimed at the bear's face. The chemical mist filled the air, but the bear only flinched before continuing its charge. The desperation in its movements made it clear. This was no defensive attack. This was predation. The bear slammed into David first, knocking him off his feet. A strangled cry of pain erupted from him as he struggled beneath the merciless claws. Emily and Mark lunged to his aid, Mark swinging his trekking pole at the bear's head while Emily tried another burst of bear spray. The bear roared, lifting its bloodied muzzle before snapping its jaws around David's shoulder. His agonized scream drowned out the sickening crunch of bone. The other two tried desperately to intervene, but the bear tossed David aside with terrifying ease, his body limp in the snow. Every fiber of Emily's body screamed at her to run, but she knew she couldn't abandon her friends. She grabbed a hunting knife from her belt and lunged at the bear, slashing at its thick hide. The blade barely penetrated. The bear reared up, towering over her, and came down with a force that sent her sprawling. Its claws raked across her back, shredding through her jacket and into her flesh. Blood spattered onto the pristine snow as she writhed and gasped in agony. Mark tried to drag Emily away, his mind racing for a solution, but the bear was relentless. It seized Emily, sinking its fangs into her torso. She let out a choking gasp, her struggles weakening. Mark screamed her name, swinging his ice axe at the bear's skull. The impact barely fazed it. In a final, horrifying moment, the bear lifted Emily's broken body and dragged her deeper into the trees. Mark was left panting, his vision blurred with panic. David was motionless, and Emily's body was disappearing into the shadows. He knew running was futile. His hands fumbled for his flare gun, his fingers numb and trembling. He fired into the sky, the red flare cutting through the bleak winter light. But before he could even hope for rescue, the bear turned its gaze on him. The chase was brief. Mark barely made it a few paces before the bear barreled into him, sending him crashing onto the ice-covered ground. The impact drove the air from his lungs, and before he could recover, the bear was on him, its jaws clamping around his thigh. He thrashed, clawing at the snow, the pain unlike anything he had ever known. The bear dragged him, his body leaving a crimson trail in the white landscape. The scene was eerily silent when other hikers arrived in response to the flare. The ground was disturbed with signs of struggle, and blood stained the snow in horrific streaks. No sign of the bear remained, but neither did the bodies. The tracks led deep into the forest, where the beast had carried its prey. The national park in the northwest corner of Wyoming had always been home to danger, but an attack of this magnitude was unheard of in winter. The park rangers searched extensively, recovering their remains scattered through the wilderness. The bear was later tracked down and euthanized, but the scars left by its rampage would never fade. For their families, the grief was unimaginable. David had been a devoted brother to his younger sister, who had often looked up to him as her protector. Emily's parents had always feared her passion for the wild would lead to tragedy, and their worst nightmare had come true. Mark had left behind an aging mother, for whom he had been the last family she had left. The story became a grim cautionary tale, a reminder that no matter how experienced one was, no one was immune to nature's raw, unrelenting force. For all its beauty, The wilderness remained an unforgiving place where survival was never guaranteed. On July 14, 2024, 5 officers were called to investigate reports of bear sightings near a remote campsite in the Wyoming backcountry. As they approached, they unknowingly cornered a young grizzly bear that had been separated from its mother. The frightened and disoriented bear charged toward the officers, desperately trying to escape. The officers reacted instantly, their training kicking in as they scrambled for their weapons and attempted to retreat. The bear was fast, faster than they had anticipated. One officer, Deputy Daryl Jensen, barely had time to raise his arm before the bear swiped at him, claws tearing through his uniform and slicing deep into his shoulder. He stumbled back, blood soaking his sleeve, his breath coming in ragged gasps as pain surged through his body. Sergeant Mike Halverson, the most experienced of the group, yelled for them to spread out, but the bear had already turned on Officer Daniel Ruiz. The young officer had tried to raise his rifle, but the sheer force of the grizzly's charge knocked him off his feet. The bear's massive paw came down on his chest, cracking ribs and forcing the air from his lungs. He gasped, unable to move as the bear's weight pinned him to the ground. The other officers scrambled, firing warning shots to drive the bear away. The sound echoed through the trees, but the panicked and aggressive bear showed no signs of backing down. It turned toward Officer Lisa Yang, who had managed to grab her bear spray. She deployed it desperately to stop the attack, the orange mist enveloping the bear's face. The animal roared in frustration, shaking its massive head and momentarily retreating, giving the officers a chance to act. Officer Jake Miller grabbed Ruiz by the collar, dragging him back while Halverson covered them. Despite the searing pain in his shoulder, Jensen reached his feet, adrenaline driving him forward. The bear, still disoriented from the spray, took a few steps back, but its fear and aggression kept it from fleeing. It reared onto its hind legs, towering over the officers, its massive form casting a shadow over them. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The officers braced themselves, knowing another attack could be fatal. Then, a loud crack echoed through the forest. A wildlife officer, responding to their distress call, fired a tranquilizer dart into the bear's side. The animal roared, staggering as the sedative took effect. It swayed on its feet before collapsing onto the ground, breathing heavily but slowly. The officers stood frozen, chests heaving, hands shaking as the reality of what had just happened set in. Backup arrived minutes later, and paramedics rushed to treat the injured officers. Jensen's shoulder wound required immediate attention. Ruiz was stabilized, despite his broken ribs, and the others nursed deep gashes and bruises. None of them had escaped unscathed, but they were alive. The bear, now unconscious, was carefully transported away from the area and relocated to a safer, uninhabited region far from human settlements. The attack served as a harsh reminder of the dangers lurking in the wilderness. It was a day for the officers they would never forget, when instinct, training, and sheer luck had kept them alive in the face of nature's raw power. In the aftermath of the attack, the department launched an internal review to evaluate its response. They had followed procedures, but the unpredictable nature of the wilderness had pushed them to their limits. Each officer faced a slow recovery, both physically and mentally. Jensen underwent surgery to repair the deep wounds on his shoulder, followed by weeks of physical therapy. Ruiz, struggling with the pain of his cracked ribs, found even simple movements agonizing. The others, though not as severely injured, bore scars that would remain with them for a lifetime. Media coverage of the attack renewed attention to the risks officers faced in remote areas. Wildlife experts debated whether the officers should have been better equipped, or if the incident was an unavoidable consequence of human-wildlife encounters. Upon recovery, the tranquilized bear was released into an isolated region, but concerns remained about increasing bear activity near human settlements. Each officer dealt with the trauma in their way. Halverson, who had always been steady under pressure, found himself replaying the attack in his mind, haunted by the moment the bear loomed over them. Despite her brave use of bear spray, Yang struggled with guilt, wondering if she could have acted faster. Miller, who had pulled Ruiz to safety, wrestled with the what-ifs. What if he had been slower? What if they hadn't been able to drive the bear away? As weeks passed, the officers reunited at the station, their bond strengthened by the ordeal. They spoke less of the attack itself and more of what came after. how each moment of pain, fear, and desperation had shaped them. They trained harder, drilled for every possible scenario, and determined that they would be even more prepared if they ever faced such a situation again. The scars remained, both visible and hidden. The memory of the bear, the weight of its presence, the raw fear of its charge, these would never fade. But neither would their survival, resilience, and determination to face whatever dangers lay ahead. They had come face to face with nature's fury and lived to tell the tale. Richard Ford had always been a man who thrived on dominance, whether in the boardroom or the wild. At 56, he had built an empire of luxury resorts and high-end properties, amassing a fortune that placed him among the wealthiest people in business in the entire world. He had a reputation for taking risks, a trait that had made him successful, but also put him in dangerous situations. His wife, Laura, had long since given up trying to discourage him from his extreme hobbies, understanding that he craved the adrenaline rush that only the wilderness could provide. Their 2 children, Christopher and Jenna, had grown accustomed to their father's frequent expeditions, each one more daring than the last. On October 5th, 2024, Ford embarked on yet another of his high-stakes adventures, a hunting trip deep in Montana's rugged backcountry. It was an exclusive, carefully planned excursion with a team of expert guides and armed security personnel. The goal was to track and hunt a mule deer, a pursuit Ford considered a challenge worthy of his skill. As always, he carried the latest hunting gear, his rifle slung across his back as he moved stealthily through the dense undergrowth. The morning air was refreshing, the wilderness alive with leaves rustling and distant wildlife calls. Ford moved ahead of his team, eager to prove himself once again. He had always prided himself on being fearless, on pushing the limits of what was considered safe. But he failed to realize that he had strayed into the territory of a grizzly bear. A massive predator had been feeding on a hidden meat cache, a fresh kill buried beneath a thicket of fallen leaves and dirt. Ford's approach was an invasion, a direct threat to the bear. The beast lifted its massive head, its black eyes locking onto the intruder. Instinct took over. The grizzly reared up on its hind legs, standing well over 9 feet tall, before letting out a deep, rumbling roar that sent a shockwave through the forest. Ford had no time to react before the bear lunged. The man tried to raise his rifle, but the grizzly swiped at him with a force that sent him sprawling onto the ground. His breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to crawl backward, but the bear was relentless. The world around him shrank to the snarling face of the predator, its saliva-drenched fangs inches from his throat. Another swipe sent him rolling, his head slamming against a tree trunk. Blood soaked his clothes as he fought to keep the animal from crushing him. His fingers fumbled for the bear spray strapped to his belt, but before he could reach it, the bear's teeth sank into his leg, the pressure like a vice-crushing bone and muscle. His screams echoed through the valley, cutting through the morning silence. His security team, hearing the commotion, sprinted toward the scene, weapons drawn. They shouted and fired warning shots, but the grizzly refused to relent. It pinned Ford down, claws digging into his torso, the primal fury of a creature protecting what was rightfully its own. One of the bodyguards managed to get a clear shot, a bullet tearing into the ground near the bear's feet. The sudden impact startled the animal just enough for it to hesitate. More shots followed, cracking through the trees, forcing the grizzly to retreat. Injured, it turned and lumbered into the dense foliage, leaving behind a scene of carnage. Ford lay on the forest floor, his body broken and bleeding. His team rushed to him, applying pressure to the deep wounds as they called for an emergency airlift. His breaths were shallow, his vision blurred, but he was still alive. The helicopter arrived within the hour, lifting him away from the wilderness that had nearly claimed his life. The attack left Ford permanently scarred, both physically and mentally. His injuries required multiple surgeries, months of rehabilitation, and a painful recovery process. The once invincible billionaire now carried the marks of his encounter with nature's rawest force. His children visited him in the hospital, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. His wife, Laura, sat by his bedside, silent but unwavering. The media exploded with the news, the attack dominating headlines. Many saw it as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most powerful men were not immune to nature's unpredictability. They criticized Ford for his reckless pursuit of danger, arguing that his presence in the bear's territory had been an unnecessary provocation. In the following years, Richard Ford often relived the attack when his world collapsed into a single primal instinct: survival. He had once believed in control, in dominance over nature, in the idea that skill and experience could shield him from the dangers of the wild. But beneath the crushing weight of the grizzly, as claws tore through flesh and breath came in ragged gasps, he learned the brutal truth. Out here, he was not a conqueror. He was prey. His hunting days ended that day, not by choice, but by the unshakable reality that nature does not negotiate. The scars etched into his body were more than just wounds. They were a permanent signature of the wilderness, a lesson written in blood and agony. He would heal, but never fully. The pain would fade, but the memory would not. He had come face to face with the raw, unrelenting force of nature, and nature had won.